Hello and welcome to Access Chat. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Tristan Lavender. Tristan, I met at the ILO conference in Geneva last year, and Tristan, whilst working in global comms for Philips, is actually the founder and chair of Philips Neurodiversity Network. So super interested to learn more about this. I was delighted when you said you'd come on and talk to us here at Access Chat. So welcome, Tristan.
Thanks for
Please
having me.
tell us a little bit about your professional journey and your journey to starting this really important network within Philips.
Yeah, well, thanks first of all for the opportunity to share my story. For me, this was really born out of a personal passion because I was diagnosed with autism in my early 20s, and especially in the early days of my career, that was a huge struggle learning to adapt to others around me whose brains work very differently from mine. And it took me a very long time also to start feeling more comfortable being open about the fact that I'm autistic. So when I finally reached that point a couple of years ago where I felt more comfortable just discussing this openly with others, I sensed that there was probably a bigger need within our company for people to start having more open conversations about this topic. And that is what led to the foundation of our neurodiversity network, really with the goal of creating psychological safety for those who are neurodivergent at Philips to start discussing their needs more openly. And we've come a long way since, so I'm happy to dive deeper into any areas that you may want to explore.
Great. So super. And Philips is headquartered in the Netherlands, but it's a global company. It's got lots of people in the US. It's a global brand doing stuff in all kinds of different areas, from healthcare to electronics to, I remember the old Philips speech recognition systems and so on. So it's been innovating for a long time. Actually, the organization that Antonio and I work for also has a lot of ex-Philips people because Origin, which was the IT, spun out and ended up in our organization. So we've got a lot of ex-Philips people working with us. So big company. I'm guessing it's pretty complex, and your network is global, right? So how many people firstly work for Philips, and then roughly how many people are in the network?
So if I remember correctly, our current number of employees is around uh, 60,000, between 60 and 70,000. And we currently have over 1,200 employees in our neurodiversity network. So I think that's a very promising start, but at the same time, there's still potential to reach many more employees as well. We've seen a massive interest in the topic. Just to give you a bit of context, Employee Resource Group Neurodiversity Network is currently the second largest employee resource group in terms of community members. So I think that shows that there's really a strong interest in the topic. And not just from those who are neurodivergent themselves, but also, for example, from parents with neurodivergent children, and also just allies who want to learn how they can better support neurodivergent colleagues.
Tristan, welcome to the program. Neil and I both have disclosed multiple times, not that I needed to, everybody probably figured it out, that we're both neurodivergent too. I was not diagnosed as neurodivergent until I was in my mid-50s, which is not surprising because I am an older woman. And it was, the way we diagnose things. Has changed, but it certainly made me understand myself a lot better. And I remember when I was diagnosed, I told Antonio Neil, and they were like, I'm so glad you finally know this, Deborah. But it's just interesting because, I might be talk too much and have annoying, traits, but also think that this beautiful brain that I was blessed with has allowed me to make a big difference in the world. So, but I remember having a conversation one time with a corporation, a very large global corporation in the United States, and we were talking about including neurodivergent people. And we got in this conversation about had we as corporate employers done the right thing by our community. And I was making a comment, which I still agree with, that because we made the community so large, it's just so large that I think parts of the community just don't, get the same supports as others. And of course, we mentioned we're not going to talk a lot about what is happening with diversity, equity, inclusion around the world right now, certainly here in the United States. But it is an interesting thing. And I remember this conversation and they said to me, well, are you saying that, Deborah, that we were properly accommodating people with neurodiversity? I said, no, I don't think we're doing that now. But the reality is neurodivergent people were in the workforce and we have been in the workforce. They called us all kind of things like AAA personalities and all kind of things that just means, Deborah, will you be quiet for a change? Anyway, but I thought that was such an important conversation. And I know also that there are groups, and it may, that believe that the neurodivergence should be pulled away from the disability identity. And I think that's interesting as well at a time when we're attacking identity. But at the same time, I think we're learning about identity because I think we broke ourselves into so many little tiny pieces, just speaking from the US perspective. And now what I'm really hoping we will do is really focus on making sure that human beings are fully included in technology and environment. But I just wanted to start the question that way, Tristan, because I remember when we were having this conversation, and it was more of a debate. She's a friend of mine, but I thought it was a really interesting conversation. So I was wondering how y'all are finding this, especially at a time when maybe it's not cool to be part of any kind of inclusion effort. Maybe it's even worse than cool. I mean, maybe you can actually get in trouble, as we've seen some companies in the United States being challenged with.
Well, I think what has always been fundamental to our philosophy as an employee resource group is that we're open to everyone. So you don't need a diagnosis as an entry ticket. Everyone is welcome to join our community. And what we have also seen is obviously a lot of neurodivergent colleagues have joined our community, but there are also many others who found a sense of belonging because they now feel that their needs are seen and recognized. So, for example, I, as an autistic person, I need a quiet work environment to focus to do my best work. But there are a lot of introverted colleagues who do not have a clinical label like autism, but they have the same need. They also need, or without wanting to overgeneralize, but many of them typically need a more quiet work environment, maybe than others. So creating the psychological safety in an organization to have these conversations, I think that is ultimately what this is all about. It's about better understanding every individual's needs, irrespective of identity. Because, for example, accommodating a person in creating a more quiet work environment when they need one, it's really all about the need rather than a label or identity per se, I think. It's about how do I
Tristan.
enable that individual to do their best work, because that also brings more value to the company.
Well, and isn't that what we're talking about a little bit anyway? Don't we want our employees to be as productive as possible? I mean, that's why you hired me, right? You hired me to be productive. And just one more point, and then I'm going to turn over to Antonio. I remember I was on a team one time. I'm from the banking industry, and it was a team of about 6 women. It happened to be all women, and we did a Myers-Briggs exercise, which I've done before. It's like, oh, it was so interesting because this Myers-Briggs, where we took it, we really examined what you were just saying. You made me think of it, Tristan, in that, you like being in a quiet environment so you can do your job and not constantly being interrupted. As you can imagine, I probably wouldn't be a good, office mate for you because that's just sort of who I am, a little bit disruptive and stuff. I'm other things too. But what we found out from doing this exercise in a different way was when I rush into this other woman's office to tell her about this excitement I have, I just disrupted her so bad for her to get herself back together to where she was before. I just thought it was such an interesting exercise. And maybe part of what we're doing now in the world is exploring those things because we want you to be as productive as possible, to be as effective as possible in your work. But some of the efforts, it feels like it's doing that.
Yeah, it's about giving a language, I think, to things that we maybe didn't discuss in the past. But ultimately, everyone benefits, irrespective of labels, because it just helps to create a work environment where everyone can play to their strengths.
Tristan, welcome. I'm very interested in exploring our organization global organization expands these networks outside the head office. Because sometimes you have this, we work for one, we know how it is. There are some very interesting initiatives happening centrally, and then how we make sure that employees who are in countries far from us also feel empowered, encouraged, and they believe that this is also for them.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, which I think will be relevant to any multinational company. I think what's interesting about our network is that we started as a global network. That was in 2022. So that was coming out of the pandemic. So at that time, it made a lot of sense to start organizing virtual events. But over time, we also recognized that a lot of the needs and challenges that neurodivergent members may have or face are locally specific, also depending on local culture, legislation. So over time, we have pivoted our strategy and we now really have a global local approach where we do have a global team, which I lead, that organizes a lot of global programs and activities, but we balance that with local initiatives and programs that are led by local teams, because you also need people leading these teams that understand the culture and the local context. So I think these two strands of work beautifully complement each other, because there are a lot of things that you can do globally to reach more people and just scale certain activities that can benefit everyone around the world. But then I think you need to complement that with local initiatives and also in-person local initiatives for people who may feel more comfortable, for example, having in-person conversations with others about such personal topics.
Excellent, thank you. I think that global to local approach is the way to go. I think that clearly, what applies in culture in the global north doesn't necessarily apply in the global south. And in fact, we see the differences even, with only a 30-mile, 45-kilometer bit of sea in between us and France, for example. Not a large distance, but there is a significant difference in the cultural approaches to disability, neurodivergence, etc. And also the schooling system. So the diagnoses are different as well. So if you
Exactly,
go
yeah.
talk to colleagues in France, there's a huge number of people that got diagnosed with DCD and dysgraphia and so on, because they still, to this day, place a high emphasis on, handwriting and so on. And I know that when I was learning to write at school, I was terrible. My writing is appalling. I mean, I might qualify to be a doctor because it's so illegible. But I'd grip my pen really hard, and my knuckles would go white, and I'd complain that it physically hurt to write. But I wasn't diagnosed with dysgraphia because after a while they stopped caring about the handwriting in the UK. Well, we didn't care about grammar either. And in the world of computers, which I was late to, but took to eventually as like a convert. Again, you don't have to write. It's wonderful. You can also dictate, but that's not the case in the education system there. So people are being diagnosed with different things. And so their experiences and the way that they have approached neurodivergence is different as well. So yeah, I fully support the concept of local chapters informing back to global.
Yeah.
So the events that you run, what sort of things do you run? Do you run awareness? Do you workshops? Do you influence are you agents of change within the organization as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We started with, the primary goal when we started the network was we wanted to create a safe space for people in our community to start exchanging experiences, insights, to really lift each other up as a community. But over time, we also saw increasing interest from managers, from leaders. So a second line of our work is not just to support the community, but also to educate the wider organization and especially managers about what they can do to provide better support to neurodivergent team members. As we like to say, to get the best out of every brain in their team, because this is not just about neurodivergent team members. Every team member has their own unique brain. So we do both types of events. We have, for example, monthly community events globally where we take a challenge that many neurodivergent people may struggle with. That could be anything ranging from sensory sensitivities to time management or other challenges that neurodivergent people may face. And there, the goal is really just to help each other, to learn from each other, to exchange practical tips and experiences. But we also have dedicated educational sessions for managers, for leaders, where they can learn what they can do to better navigate neurodiversity in their team. So it's a broad range of events with different audiences and different purposes.
To somehow complement the question, do you see these communities as having a positive impact on how Philips creates products and solutions for their users, for their consumers?
Could definitely be an area where we could add more value, but in honesty, that hasn't been our focus in the first few years of our existence. But it could in the future become another area of a focus for us. And maybe also to answer your earlier question about, being a change agent influencing the organization, I think that is also a really important role that we can play. We amplify the voice of our community, and we therefore also help the organization better understand what is needed to be a better employer for neurodivergent employees specifically, but ultimately for everyone. So, for example, one way in which we do that is we conduct surveys within our community, and then we share that data on an anonymized aggregate level with senior leaders, with HR teams, to better inform them about what is needed to make changes to policies or practices. And that has been really appreciated, that we work in collaboration with the organization also, because it ultimately helps the organization better understand what they can do to move this forward.
Boy, y'all teed up my question. That is just perfect. The question that I have, because that is such a good point, but it also can cause problems. So the good point is it's really important for employees to feel engaged and like they are making a difference and helping the brand move forward. And so there's so much benefit that the brand gets from this, so much benefit. And these are your team members. And so I remember talking to Capital one time, long time ago, when I was helping them with accessibility. And I remember when we were just starting. They've got it so far at this point. But when they were just starting, we were talking about where are the priorities? Are the priorities the customer facing? Where are we going to start first? We got to do this. Where are we going to start? Are they the customer facing? Or maybe you take care of your employees? And we were having these conversations. And of course, the right answer is you do them simultaneously. Okay, whatever. We were having the questions, and they came back and they said, well, our employees pretty much like us. And so maybe we'll start making sure the customers are good and happy and also helping our employees, but we feel our employees will work with us to make this work. And I just remember their response was different from what other brands were saying. So I was impressed with that. But then going back to, so I agree with all of that. But if it's not done right, when it is not done right, I have also seen where employees get so disenfranchised and so frustrated with the brand that they start leaving and quitting. And so it is so important that brands do this right, listen, but it's also, there are a lot of ways, Tristan, they can get it wrong. And so I was just wondering if we could just explore that a little bit, because I have seen from inclusion, I've seen disability inclusion ones go horribly wrong for brands, horribly wrong. And they wind up losing some of their best employees because what we are not interested in them doing, obviously Philips is not doing this. We're not interested in them just putting them together, pretending like we have something that you care about. No, we actually want you to listen to what we're saying with a balance, But I just wanted to explore the little tiny dangers there too.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned the word education because I think every manager, leader wants to do the right thing for their people, but they may not always be aware of certain barriers that neurodivergent employees may be facing. Going back to the early example that I gave about myself and maybe others needing a quiet environment, that is something that, a leader who's more extroverted, who likes to have people around them, may not necessarily be aware of, because it's just their natural way of being and interacting with others, that they enjoy the energy of being surrounded by people. I've had conversations with managers who found it genuinely eye-opening when I shared my personal experience, for example, how I may experience a day in the office. So I think there's a lot of willingness to learn, but without that knowledge, yes, it could very well be that neurodivergent employees don't necessarily get the accommodations that they need, which may have all sorts of unintended consequences.
Right. Well, and also, this was not just about accommodations where they went, this one brand I'm not going to mention, where they went wrong, because what happened was there were policy changes that the networks had gotten together based on things that were happening in the world, and you got to be paying attention. And this brand was being very tone deaf and until their employees caught their attention. They definitely got their attention. So it's just important to always be listening to these things and for brands to make sure they're taking them seriously. This is not just a little conversation we're having to talk about ADHD or autism. No, this is we're here to help this brand be more successful. We want
Exactly. Yeah.
ways, we want it to be a win for all, but they do have to have the right executive sponsors and, you know.
Absolutely. And Neil, yeah, you mentioned innovation earlier in the conversation. That is also how we frame the added value of neurodiversity in conversations with senior leadership. This is not just about supporting the individual. Ultimately, this is what the company also needs. We need people with different perspectives. We need people with different ways of thinking, because that is ultimately what helps drive innovation.
That's the main thrust of your business is innovation.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so if we were going and sort of rolling back the clock over the decades before we had all of these labels and everything else, the neurodivergent people in your company would have been the boffins, right? And
Exactly.
essentially just, you need to point out to management, protect the boffins, make sure the boffins are happy, because the boffins are the ones that make this company tick. So, but you were talking about needs, and I'm neurodivergent, you're neurodivergent, but we have very different needs, right? And I have a very neurodivergent team, and those needs frequently conflict. We have different needs, and there's a tension there. So when you have multiple people with neurodivergencies, we all have needs. We all have a right to expect that our needs are met, and that there are the challenges that we face are accepted too. How do you broker compromise? Because actually, when you have a bunch of people that have these conflicting needs, how do you then create some kind of balance between some of those conflicting needs? Because it shouldn't be that one individual gives up all of their needs to meet the needs of another. So how do you manage that tension sometimes?
That is an excellent question. And I think one that doesn't get asked enough, because often in the neurodiversity conversation, it's about what does the individual need. But most of us work in teams. And to your point, Neil, different team members will often have conflicting needs. I'll give you one example to answer your question. So what I've experienced also in the teams that I'm part of is that some team members prefer to stay off camera during meetings for different reasons. They may find it anxiety inducing, or especially if they have a lot of calls during the day, they just may find it genuinely exhausting to be on camera all day long. So these are all very valid reasons why they prefer to stay off camera. But I've also had conversations with, for example, dyslexic colleagues who've told me, like, yeah, I really need someone to be on camera because I rely on lip reading in order to follow the conversation. I think that is a nice example of where different team members, especially neurodivergent team members, may have conflicting needs. So I think the solution is to have an open team conversation about these things to better understand what each individual needs, and then sometimes also meet each other halfway. So in this, sticking to this example, maybe you could agree, for example, that when you're talking during the meeting, you switch on your camera. But then when you're done talking, maybe it's okay to switch off your camera, because that allows in this case, this dyslexic person to follow along with what's being said. But it allows, for example, maybe the autistic person who doesn't like to be on camera all the time to then switch off their camera once they're done talking. So that is just one super practical example, but I think you can only get to that point when, as a team, you develop the language to have these conversations and also feel the psychological safety to express your needs, and then find a way of meeting each other halfway when needed.
Yeah, and I think that, sometimes when you've created that psychological safety, you can get these conversations and that's just going really large. It's like, hello, we still need to do some work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And we broker these things amongst our team members. And like you say, sometimes camera on, sometimes camera off. I think that if I'm right in thinking there's some features in Teams now where you can actually set it so that you can have your camera on, but you don't see yourself.
Yeah.
So
That's a nice,
those
yeah.
kind of things where people are actually starting to understand the needs and allow you to configure technology in a way that starts to minimize those conflicts a little bit. I mean, it's not always that we talk about Teams minimizing accessibility needs, because I think that it can be a big thing for cognitive overload. But I think that that's a good example of where you're able to balance those conflicting needs quite well.
Yeah.
And Antonio, I think, had a final question before we're coming towards the end of our time, but I think he could squeeze a quick one in.
In order to progress, this is not something that organizations can do alone. So I'm curious to know from you, Tristan, how do you engage with other organizations outside the office? How your employees do that? How can we somehow work all together to improve advocacy and to change things for the better?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think there are a lot of networks within this domain. Just a few weeks ago, I was in London also with peers from other companies where we exchanged learnings, which was very insightful because I think we're all figuring this out together. I don't think there's any organization that has fully figured out what it means to be neuro inclusive. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other as we mature, each at our own pace. So I would encourage anyone in this space just to connect with others like we're doing in this conversation as well, because you don't need to figure it out on your own. There's a lot that you can learn from others who've done this before.
Yeah, very true. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your experience with us. I need to thank Amazon and My Clear Text for keeping us on air and keeping us captioned. And I really look forward to us being able to continue this conversation and hopefully widen the net as we bring in more people on social media and have these open conversations. So thank you once again, Tristan. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
It was a privilege. Thank you for having me.